Now, we all know that just occasionally it can be slightly difficult to get a straight answer from a politician.
Tell the people of Greater Manchester, are you scrapping the HS2 line between Birmingham and Manchester?
I know there's a lot of speculation on this, but we've already got spades in the ground on the first bit of HS2, and what we're doing is getting on with delivering it. Now, of course, always
so that's
government is making sure... As I said, we've got spades in the ground on phase one, and we're getting on with delivering it. But it's always,
so what about
it's always the case that government...
So what about phase two?
But it's always right that the government... Well, if I could just finish...
That's Rishi Sunak being interviewed by BBC Radio Manchester's Anna Jameson. Funnily enough, she wouldn't accept word salad in place of an answer.
Sorry, I feel just like we're going off topic here, and I just want to keep it focused on HS2 because you haven't. We're straight talking people in the north. It's a yes or a no. Are you scrapping the HS2 line between Birmingham and Manchester?
No, like I said, I'm not speculating on future things. We've got spades in the ground right now, and we're getting on. But what people also want to know... government is always making sure that we get value for money out of everything we do.
When first given the go-ahead back in 2012, High Speed Rail 2 was supposed to cost £32.7 billion. Fast forward more than a decade, and costs have spiralled, more than doubling. And we still don't yet know where it starts in the south and finishes in the north.
Still now, you can't give me a yes or a no, and you're the man in control. You have the keys. You can tell us now if that's happening.
But Anna, my point to you is the vast majority of the journeys that people make are in their cars, making sure that we make sure our roads are well maintained.
But we're talking about trains, we're not talking about cars.
But HS2 is but the latest in a very long line of overrunning, overspending infrastructure projects. Time and time again, billions of pounds of public money have been wasted, and all we seem to get are shrugged shoulders and "oh shucks" from the politicians in charge.
Mr. Sunak, we'll have to leave it there because you've got our colleagues to speak to. Thank you very much for your time.
I'm Niall Paterson, and in this edition of the Sky News Daily, whilst the Prime Minister works out where he wants to put his train set, we'll be asking, why is the UK so bad at big infrastructure projects? Sky's business correspondent is Paul Kelso, and guess what? He joins me once again in the studio. Good to see you, Paul.
And you.
Let's start with HS2, High Speed 2.
It would put 2/3 of the population of northern England within 2 hours of central London. This is the promise of HS2, a project that's causing endless controversy.
Remind us, what was the point of this in the first place? Because the high-speed bit is the bit that everyone focuses on, and then they look at the journey times and we're shaving off 10 minutes here and there.
Yeah, it became an argument about why are we going to spend all this money to make it 20 minutes quicker to get from Manchester to London. There were more arguments. The sell was around speed. We have to go back to 2009 for when this first became a project. It was Gordon Brown's administration that wanted it. There were other arguments, particularly around capacity. At that point, the railways were overcrowded. Everybody knew that. The West Coast Main Line particularly faced its own problems around how you maintain and regenerate it to make sure it was still able to meet huge passenger demand. And there's also a bigger, wider economic argument about not just boosting productivity by making it quicker to get from one end of the country to the other, but also about spreading the wealth. And that particularly became the argument as we moved through to the coalition and then the final all clear from Boris Johnson's government. It became yoked to the levelling up agenda, and you help use it as an artery to spread some of the wealth out of London to the north.
The one thing that we can say with certainty that has levelled up here is the overall cost. I mean, 2012, it was supposed to cost, what, £32.7 billion? It's a lot more than that now.
That was the original number. The most recent number in the review that was the basis for Boris Johnson's decision to go ahead, when he was in favour of going ahead with all of it, that was before he cut half of it, was 70 billion. That was the Oakervy review. Remember, these numbers, helpfully, are 2015 numbers, so you have to work everything back, and they occasionally get adjusted for inflation. That's what's going on in the background here. The Treasury probably knows what the new inflation number, on top of any actual cost increases, everyone expects it to start to be in the at least 100 billion, and who knows what they're currently looking at in the Treasury in number 10.
You could put a man on the moon for that amount of money. So why is it costing so much?
It is really expensive to start with, and this is a particularly complex and ambitious way of doing it. Part of the problem with HS2 is everyone had a different idea about where it should go. Just looking at something the other day, why doesn't it run along the M40 and up the M6? And you take those roads or take existing rail lines along those routes and you can see motorway, railway line, canal. When they dug the canals, they did them up so you stick your functional arteries, your infrastructure in the same place.
Makes sense.
This is not following that. We're going to go straight to Birmingham and we're going to go through an area of outstanding natural beauty, through the widest part of the Chilterns, where most of the constituencies are conservative. So you add in the political element. Most of the expense is in the first bit to Birmingham. The most expensive bit of all is from Old Oak Common to Euston, which, by the way, you're going to have to bulldoze quite a lot of Camden. May or may not be popular, but probably not if you live there. It gets cheaper the further north it gets. It gets more popular the further north it gets. But on top of that, it's gold-plated. This project is to the highest possible specifications. But it is, we have to be careful around the numbers, but around 300 million a mile. That's 10 times what it cost to build a recent bit of high-speed rail in northern France.
Now, the French just better at building railways.
Things that trip us up here and seem to repeatedly trip us up are land costs. We're smaller. Okay, you sail through France and think, why is it so easy? Well, look around you. Massive Centrale is massive and there's not an enormous amount in the way. Of course, if your home is in the way, it hurts just as much. Planning takes forever in the UK. Terminal 5, the public inquiry consultation was 4 years to build a new terminal at an airport that already had 4. It gives you an idea of the kind of things that get in the way. Indecision, political indecision and delay is probably the number one, because that's when you do finally decide to build and you start building, any hold-ups. Phasing is the euphemism for trying to essentially, what's going on now, shove the costs into another parliament to make them someone else's. Another government. Make the Treasury's numbers, which are based on short 5-year targets, make them add up. Those cause cost increases. And that's where, when you're in an argument, you might be in an argument with your developer about, why is this more expensive? Well, if you keep changing your mind, it gets more expensive.
You mentioned that final leg potentially coming through Camden to hook up with the Euston station. At the time of recording, we don't know if they're even going to go that far. So how can one have an infrastructure project on this scale spend tens of billions of pounds on already, and we don't yet know where the end point is going to be? I mean, how is that possible?
The only explanation is the political indecision and lack of will, and that's where I think the one common, we can run through a list of projects that have faced similar problems. If you have got consent and there's certainty, because these are 20-year projects, even if you're going quickly, you need to know it's going to happen. And there has been backsliding and shifting. I mean, in the last 3 years alone, we've already seen it reduced by 50%. Remember, not even 2 years since the eastern leg to Leeds was axed and cut. We were told actually it wasn't being cut. It would still be high speed, just not new high speed rail. I wonder if that's what we end up with on the other leg as well. But this is a world-class failure, HS2, to end up with a shuttle that goes from Acton to Birmingham, the most over-spec'd, high-speed and presumably incredibly expensive service that'll take longer than the current train line.
In a previous incarnation, I was a political correspondent. I lost count of the number of government infrastructure projects that didn't come in on or under budget. I mean, it was almost a truism. Government infrastructure projects always overspend. Run us through a few of the others, because, as you say, there have been some sort of successes when it comes to big spending projects.
The Olympics probably stands out as the one example of getting it right.
65% of the £2 billion contingency still remains. So we've got a very good cushion to address any unforeseen risks.
The original budget, of course, wasn't the one that it was delivered for, but the end budget was £9.3 billion and it was on time and under budget. But that was only once they'd quadrupled the budget.
So they fiddled it. So what are you talking about? That's not a good example.
To gain public consent for a glorious national project, things they did well, they clearly managed it. Like having a hard deadline and the eyes of the world on it helped. It's also actually quite a lot more simple. Think of most of it happened in the Lee Valley. It had footprint of old industry there, some of which was very reluctant to leave, but it was essentially It was ripe for redevelopment. A lot of the focus was on the high-profile stuff, the stadium, the velodrome, the aquatic centre. They did some really big, gnarly infrastructure stuff. They undergrounded, which is a dreadful word, they buried the power lines. They made a huge deal of that. I was constantly being briefed about how exciting it was. But actually, it removed all those pylons. It meant you had a blank canvas above ground you could build on. It served for the huge redevelopment. There were a couple of things that got wrong. The aquatic centre, incredibly lavish Zaha Hadid project, came in way over budget. They cut it back. It ended up costing more, and you ended up with temporary wings. But on the whole, it was delivered.
With our previous comments about budget in mind, how did they manage to bring it in on budget and on time, of course, because the Olympics did go ahead?
They did some things to make it cheaper. The stadium is not a state-of-the-art arena. All the problems with getting it to West Ham afterwards. The gold-plated version, that's Stade de France, where the stands moved to reveal running tracks and everything. They did it in a pretty cheaper way. And actually, an Olympics in one place, as that was, relatively is straightforward. And also, you had special powers, so you could essentially, anyone who didn't like it, and plenty of people in the Lee Valley didn't, they got shifted. So it had that political will. But it does stand out like a beacon.
Paul, tell us about some of the flops.
Crossrail, remember Crossrail?
I do indeed.
It's very popular now. It's been rebranded the Elizabeth Line. Cost £18 billion. It's 3.5 years later. That's £4 billion over budget. It was the gold standard for messing up a rail project.
The criticism we've received has been justified. It's a huge disappointment, and it's costing more public money.
Now it's open, vast quantity of London and national rail traffic because it works. People like the high speed rail. Hinkley Point C, we're still waiting for. Should have opened in 2017. Current price tag 26 billion. That's 8 billion over budget and 10 years late. That's the model, by the way, for Sizewell C, which will be the new nuclear project. And apparently the lessons learned from Hinkley Point will cut the costs there. HS1, what is HS1?
No idea.
HS1 is the Channel Tunnel rail link from St Pancras to, which, by the way, helped the Olympics because it ran through Stratford, so the Olympics could piggyback that. Again, works fantastically if you're on the Eurostar. It was only $1 billion over budget, but it was only $1 billion on a budget of £6 billion. It was 16 years between Michael Heseltine announcing it and it being delivered. What's it got in common with HS2, apart from its catchy name? It was split into 2 phases. It attempted to spread the cost. All it did was balloon the cost. There are many, many more. Edinburgh's tram, close to your heart, nearly £800 million. I make it the biggest overruns, 400 million over budget for a service that isn't universally popular. But all of them have in common. It's expensive to buy land in the UK. The planning system is hugely onerous. Politicians wobble when the money is so extreme. Democracy is a real bummer when it comes to building stuff.
Paul, take a breather. In just a moment, we'll be discussing the sheer wastefulness of it all. We are back discussing those big infrastructure projects like HS2 with our business correspondent Paul Kelso, because we're talking about tens, hundreds, potentially hundreds of billions of pounds of needless expenditure on the basis of blueprints and plans that were drawn up beforehand. I mean, we've got tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people using food banks in this country. We have a problem with rough sleeping in this country. We have a problem with drug abuse and a health service that, let's be fair, is creaking at best. What I have never understood is why, when we are signing contracts with developers, with the organisations that produce these big infrastructure projects, why we don't put in penalty clauses, why we don't put in break clauses, that if the project starts to spiral in terms of expenditure, you say, no, that's on you. You're going to have to pick that up.
It's a really good point, and it's one that I think HS2 is particularly vulnerable on, in that certainly of that most recent review I talked about, one of the things it said, we think the case is there to continue with this project because, frankly, if you spent the money now, you won't deliver any of the value if you don't finish it. But only go ahead once you have reviewed the cost properly and reviewed the contract. It seems the contracts did not sufficiently penalise delays on the developer side. But there are only so many people who can do these projects, and every country in the world and in Europe is constantly pushing for fresh infrastructure. I had a conversation with a huge concrete supplier, really revealing. They make big prefabricated sections for your thing that needs concrete. I don't know specifically what they make on HS2, but they do it for nuclear power stations. Anyway, you need big purpose-built stuff. And they said the thing that HS2 and Hinkley Point have got in common is they never query an invoice, and they never, as far as they can see, negotiate around quotes. Because once you're up and running, ultimately, the bill is being paid by the bottomless pit of the Treasury, or so it seems from their side. And that's anecdotal, but it seems to me to speak to an issue here about if you are, this probably building your own house is not the greatest analogy, but if you're paying every penny, you try and manage it as tightly as you can. Mm-hmm. This is before we get into the explosion in inflation, supply chain pressures, and all of this, what's coming down the track. We talked about lots of projects crucial to the UK. We've barely even started. The next 30 years, if we don't massively invest in infrastructure, we're not going to hit any of our targets.
You're going to upset me again, aren't you? What's coming down the non-existent pipeline?
The non-existent track is the energy transition, which we talk about a lot. We talk about net zero, feels a bit opaque and a little unclear. What it means in practice is we're going to have to completely overhaul the national grid, which historically, and as we operate now, we have a few power stations, relatively, from which all the pylons emerge and then thence to our homes. So you've got a few big connections to the grid. The future is thousands, millions of connections, whether it's our car charging point or, more important for infrastructure, bringing on shore massive amounts of offshore wind, which is produced in the North Sea, but is needed largely in the south of England. There's a huge project National Grid have got planned, Norwich to Tilbury, it's called, and it's 110 miles of pylons. A bit of undergrounding, which is more expensive. Planning process has started. We're years away from shovels in the ground, but the opposition along that route in every village is already being marshalled. So that's just one example, and there will be many, many more of this huge demand. Interesting, offshore wind, which is actually where it starts, the planning is complicated, but it's not as complicated because nobody lives out there. And the private sector has been very good at delivering it and building it, but it hasn't been very good, the government so far, just recently, at providing a price at which you can afford to make it, which is another problem. But we're at the start of an industrial revolution, which will akin to the Victorian explosion.
We've been talking about bricks and mortar infrastructure projects, but you can add on to that Ministry of Defence procurement, IT spend. They always overspend when it's a government contract. This is me taking you slightly away from your brief and your day job. Is there not now fundamentally an argument for taking control of projects like this out of central government? Setting up some form of body where you can bring in experience from the private sector. Is there no way of doing this that doesn't involve massive overspend and projects not coming in on time?
Everywhere on the whole ends up spending a bit more. Whatever your contingency is, it gets spent. But what you're talking about sounds like you might want something, I don't know, you might call it the National Infrastructure Commission, perhaps. And
totally.
Perhaps you might get the person who delivered the Olympics to chair it. That'd be a good idea. That's exactly what we've got. So John Armitt chairs the National Infrastructure Commission, which helped produce a National Industrial Strategy, which the government adopted, and this is not a political point, but it was ditched. There's a glorious dead end on gov.uk when you seek to find it. It was ditched 21, 22. So instead of an overarching, and this government's right, okay, instead of an overarching strategy for infrastructure, we have what is a much more piecemeal approach, and we've seen it in the way checks have been written to build EV battery factories, Safeport, Talbot Steel manufacturing. It's probably achieving some of the same ends, but it's not being done in that overarching way. And I know Sir John Armitt, we talked about the sewers and water. £70 billion is his estimate of what it will take.
Banging my head off the table right now.
Is what it will take to renew our Victorian sewage system. We have this incredible legacy of railways, sewers, all built 150 years ago. We haven't really touched them since. Just a reference point, the Great Western Railway Brunel's billiard table, as it's known, London to Bristol, it was built in 6 years.
What? Okay, right.
I mean, that was in the 1830s when...
True, yeah.
I'm guessing local opposition didn't have Instagram to organise.
Yeah, and I'm fairly certain that the navvies didn't have quite the same working conditions as...
20% of the workers died, I think.
As we've been sitting here, I've noticed that the former Deputy Chair of the HS2 Review, Lord Barclay, has said that this project could ultimately, from a starting budget of, what was it, a little over £30 billion, could cost 180 billion. We are awaiting direction from Rishi Sunak, from government, as to what is going on. What's your best bet?
I don't know more about it than Lord Barclay, whose opposition is now fully entrenched.
But do you think it's going to go ahead? Do you think we will see that link?
I think it will be.
Do you think it will go to Manchester?
Possibly in our lifetimes. I think we will see a decision postponed the other side of the Conservative Party conference in Manchester, being held in a former station building. The optics were not ideal, and I think we'll see it shoved into beyond the next Parliament, which ultimately will help increase that bill. And if, when this was first talked about by Gordon Brown, he'd said it would cost £180 billion, the chance of it going ahead will be very slim. It is an epic failure thus far, HS2. There is much that is wrong with it. The big argument in favour is you've started, you have to finish, otherwise you get none of the value, even at that unbelievable price tag.
Paul, do you know what? I'm off for a lie down in a dark room. Thanks very much, I think.
I'm off to view my train time.